Bien, pues vamos a continuar y bueno, la verdad es que para nosotros es una satisfacción especial haber tenido la oportunidad de invitar a William Catton y de que haya aceptado la invitación, porque, bueno, personalmente, porque cuando hace muchos años me pregunté por la sociología sobre temas de medio ambiente que se hacía en Estados Unidos, fue el primer nombre que encontré, junto con Alice Neighbor. Y cuando digo a mis colegas que el concepto, en conversaciones entre sociólogos, que el concepto de capacidad de carga es aplicable a poblaciones humanas, pues es muy habitual que me digan, bueno, eso es reduccionismo biologista o naturalismo. Capacidad de carga es un concepto de la biología y no hay sociólogos que lo consideren como una categoría sociológica. Entonces yo puedo responder, no, sí que hay, sí. Catton, uno de los fundadores de la moderna sociología ecológica, insiste en que la capacidad de carga es un concepto relevante para las ciencias sociales. Bueno, Catton es profesor emérito de sociología en la Washington State University, en la Universidad Pública del Estado de Washington. Combatió en la Segunda Guerra Mundial en la Marina i va treure el doctorat en Sociologia en la Universitat de Washington, on va ensenyar fins a 1970 i aleshores va traslladar-se a Nova Zelanda, convertint-se en el primer professor de Sociologia de la Universitat de Canterbury, allí. I, bueno, pues ha estat professor en diferents universitats, en els Estats Units, en Canadà, en Nova Zelanda, en Austràlia, en Noruega, en Anglaterra, i ha treballat en l'ús i la gestió d'espais naturals, o va treballar el que li va portar a interessar-se pels principis de l'ecologia. I, de fet, ha publicat més de 100 articles en revistes científiques i capítols de llibres i ressenyes o recensions de llibres, una activitat intel·lectual molt important i en particular molt important en sociologia. Qualsevol que mire, per exemple, les seccions de ressenyes de llibres en l'anès sociològic, en la revista de UIMP o en la Zeitschrift, en la revista de l'Escola de Frankfurt, veurà que més de la meitat eren ressenyes bibliogràfiques. Dissortadament ara és molt difícil fer reseñas bibliográficas en las revistas científicas, perdón, me he pasado sin... Bueno, pero aparte de sus publicaciones de artículos y capítulos de libros, hay dos obras realmente muy importantes que quiero destacar. La primera la publicó en 1980, se titulaba Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Science, que supuso la importación a la sociología de todo el gran debate sobre límites al crecimiento y la amenaza de sobrepasamiento, translimitación y, por consiguiente, colapso que se cernía sobre el horizonte, la advertencia del ecologismo incorporada o integrada en la sociología. Desgraciadamente, este libro solo ha sido traducido al castellano muy recientemente y su impacto en el desarrollo de la sociología ecológica en España y en América Latina se ha visto limitado por este hecho. De hecho, se ha traducido cuando, más o menos al mismo tiempo que aparecía su libro más reciente, Bottelneck, que es el tema de la conferencia que va a dar hoy, y que de alguna manera proyecta la misma problemática, recogiendo o reflejando la diferencia fundamental entre la situación de 1980 y la actual. En 1980 se trataba todavía de lanzar la advertencia, de avisar de que había un peligro, una amenaza en caso de continuar el crecimiento económico y demográfico desmedido en el siglo XXI, y en la actualidad un poco el problema es más bien que esa amenaza se ha convertido en realidad, que ya estamos en esa situación y estamos entrando, por tanto, en una época de angosta, de dificultades crecientes y de condiciones muy estrictas impuestas por los límites de la naturaleza. A eso hace referencia la metáfora del cuello de botella que da título al libro. De alguna manera, si el libro de 1980 expresó en sociología la advertencia de que hay límites al crecimiento propia de la época, el libro reciente es el recordatorio en sociología de que el anuncio de hace 30 años ya es nuestra realidad de hoy. Así que muchas gracias y le cedo la palabra al profesor R.Catton.
Gracias. I learned a lesson in the previous session that probably was not intended by either of the speakers. I learned a lesson that could perhaps be summed up with the title of a popular song years ago. I don't know the song. I never knew anything more than the title. The title was Que Sera, Sera. And the sense in which I learned that lesson in the previous session was that I wish that 75 years ago, when I was a schoolboy and I had a number of Spanish-speaking schoolmates, that I had taken advantage of that opportunity to learn some Spanish. I think about all of my vocabulary now would be Feliz Navidad. So I will have to speak in English, and I admire the fact that there are people who can translate into a different language. Here we go. Let's begin at the beginning. This planet, our species' only home, formed some 4.5 billion years ago by accretion. Hordes of loose matter whirling around the sun gradually coalesced by mutual gravitation into larger aggregates, the planets, with orbits of various radii. Earth's orbit is the third one out from the sun. It's where we live, but almost 1.8 billion years elapsed after it was formed before there was any life on it. It did not have only solid components, it also had enough liquid water, apparently, so that some of those solid components could be dissolved in liquid. When solutions of just the right consistency had formed, some of it was subjected to chemical transformation by energy impulses, perhaps from electrical discharges, lightning, or from volcanic sources, and self-replicating molecules were formed. Interactions among such molecules eventually produced bounded units that could grow and reproduce, feeding on their surroundings. For more than 1 billion years after they came into being and began proliferating, these single-celled organisms were the only life on Earth. These cyanobacteria could thrive under an atmosphere with little or no free oxygen, but rich in CO2. For them, oxygen was a waste product given off by their metabolic processes. As it accumulated in the primordial atmosphere, the Earth became a different sort of environment from what it had been. It became increasingly inhospitable to these earliest life forms, but more and more suitable for new forms. Single-celled creatures had gradually become differentiated, and some varieties served as food for others. Eventually, it happened that the differences among them enabled some to interact with different others in ways that were mutually beneficial. Instead of an ingested cell being broken down as mere food for the cell consuming it, it remained intact as an organelle inside that cell. Perhaps this was parasitism at first. Eventually, it was endosymbiosis. After hundreds of millions of years more had passed, another version of symbiosis occurred, formation of multi-celled organisms. These became differentiated in time into several kingdoms, many orders, families, genera, and species. Many were so constructed that an oxygen-rich atmosphere was what they could thrive in, though it had been toxic to their single-celled distant ancestors. All were dependent upon organic or inorganic components of their surroundings for carrying on the life processes of growth and reproduction. And their populations could only increase within limits imposed by the physical and chemical characteristics of their surroundings and the availability of energy to power their chemical activities. Now, what I'm getting at here is that we are utterly dependent upon the kind of world in which we live. And that world has changed, and now we are changing it, and we're changing it in ways that we're not yet adjusting to properly. So let's fast forward to a time when there had come to be recognizable differences between several organic kingdoms, especially the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. And within the animal kingdom, there were such categories as invertebrates and vertebrates. Fast forward still further to a time when animals as well as plants had colonized dry land rather than all living in the sea. Zoom down to an area on which trees of various types grow abundantly, constituting a forest populated by diverse animals. Among the vertebrate denizens of that environment in a tropical land were creatures that would someday be classified as primates. As climate changed and vast expanses of forested land dwindled away, increased patchiness of tree cover left large stretches of grassland intervening, so a species of formerly tree-dwelling apes adapted to the new circumstance by becoming bipedal. This released their front limbs with hands previously adapted for grasping tree branches for a more elaborate repertoire of uses. Millions of years of adaptation to the new environmental conditions led to repeated branching of the descendant hominid populations into a variety of species, some of which increasingly made use of non-food solid materials to contrive useful artifacts, enabling them to do things their bodily organs unaided could not do well. Many species supported by the earth had come now to include some that were members of our genus Homo. They increased in number and began spreading out over available lands. Solar energy falling upon chlorophyll-containing plants provided food for them and for the animals occasionally consumed by them. Occasional lightning-caused wildfires were a serious threat, usually infrequent. I read in our news media in the United States about some serious wildfires that were here in the Valencia region this summer, and I was wondering whether this seminar was going to be called off. I'm glad it wasn't. The point is that for a time, all that humans and other animals could do when there was a wildfire was flee from that area. But sometime back long ago, before there were members of our species, Homo sapiens, some earlier hominid species, and it is now expected that probably it was Homo erectus, one of the early predecessors of Homo sapiens, that discovered that you could carry fire from one place to another. You could pick up a burning branch and carry it, and then you could light fires to your own convenience. That was revolutionary. And the point is that the effects of that are now being felt in a way that nobody foresaw. Certainly Homo erectus didn't foresee it. Most Homo sapiens have not really foreseen what the effects of it were. Anyway, fire could be used by these pre-sapiens hominids for various purposes: for protection from predatory animals, for warmth of the cave they lived in or whatever, for chemically transforming, that is, cooking foodstuffs. All prior life had derived all required energy from sunlight directly or indirectly through biological intermediaries. But these pre-sapiens humans had gone a step further. When Homo erectus learned to use fire and not merely flee from it, this was an extremely significant event in biotic history. And we're now beginning to reap some of the consequences of it that were not foreseen. Even though the scope of uses at that time remained initially quite limited. No non-human species ever made this achievement. Think about the fact that we have some other denizens of this planet that have brains bigger than ours, dolphins and whales, but they live in water, so they couldn't begin to learn to use fire. They didn't have to flee from it either, I guess. Or the small species that have populated the whole planet, insects, they're too small, too vulnerable. They can't begin to carry fire from one place to another. So that's something unique to human beings and their earlier forms. Ultimately, fire would be used in ways that would drastically alter human lives and would begin to alter the world. When controlled fire became a feature of human culture and spread to all populations of Homo sapiens, it enabled our ancestors to advance from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age and to the Iron Age. How so? Well, fire made metallurgy possible, launched us onto a path of ever onward and upward technological progress. At least we thought it was ever onward and upward. But this brought us to the very essence of our human condition. Our ancestors' many technological achievements made us reliant upon continuing use of non-renewable resources. This reliance enabled us to come to the present impasse. We have approached the brink of scarcity after passing through an era of abundance we supposed could continue escalating forever. Our politicians continue promising growth. They and most of the people that they lead assume growth is progress, but they disregard an essential fact about our use of Earth's substances, the finiteness of the buried stocks of ores and fuels that we've now become dependent upon using. There is a phrase that's now current, Hubbert's Peak, that's used by geologists to refer to an event whose aftermath will squelch the hubris of mankind, the overconfidence of our species. We all need to open our minds to unintended but profound consequences of the ineluctably temporary bonanza. I guess that's a Spanish word too, isn't it? I know more than I thought I did. The ineluctably temporary bonanza that we naively imagined could be perpetual, passing the peak of world oil production, is a crucial transition in a long and continuing evolutionary process. The inevitable shift to a contracting future for humanity after an era of accelerated expansion and social progress attributable to petroleum-fueled economic growth. Now, when I was writing Overshoot 35 years ago, a brief oil embargo by the oil-exporting nations had begun to show how vital to modern life is a supply of energy. Like now, it was a time of confusion. After venting anger at Arabs and oil companies, Europeans and Americans began to realize new concepts had to be absorbed for thinking about the predicament humanity was facing. It was more than a crisis, more fundamental than a mere problem. Crises pass. Problems usually have solutions, though these are sometimes elusive. Predicaments are bigger, more basic. Our predicament was not of recent origin and wouldn't soon abate. Indeed, it has since deepened. We're deeper in it right now than we ever imagined we would be. Various writers have begun to link the predicament to hubris manifested in various ways. I once wondered what the word hubris meant, and somebody told me that if you listen to the triumphal march in the opera Aida, You get a sense of hubris, and I did, and I got that sense. So I recommend that. Historian Kevin Phillips told us not to regard the petroleum era as extending only back to the drilling of the first oil well in 1859. Pre-fuel uses of petroleum are traceable at least to medieval times. Later on, more and more of this rock oil was used for illumination to replace decreasingly abundant whale oil. And as it went on to become the abundant source of prodigious quantities of flexible energy for myriad tasks, abundant oil fed American success in World War II. Prior to that, as Phillips said, British world supremacy had been powered by coal. Still earlier, Spanish naval dominance of the world had been wind-powered. In all of these cases, energy was the key to each instance. But we need to look even further into the past. Now, I was lucky in my childhood not only to live where I could have learned some Spanish and was too stupid to do so, but to live in southwestern Colorado where there was an interesting feature of the landscape only a few miles from my home. This is the Black Canyon of the Gunnison River. That river eroded its way down through very hard rock in something like 10 million years. And since I lived there from the age, not very far from that scene, from the age of 5 to the age of 10, the concept of 10 million years was something that was embedded in my brain very early. Most people think of something that was a century ago as old. Americans think of something that was 50 years ago as old. Europeans think of something that was 2,000 years ago as very old. But 10 million years, it's an important concept to get a hold of. Overwhelming dependence on an exhaustible resource has roots in an ancient trend established long prior to the crescendo in the most recent half-century. And I think it was my good fortune that I lived where I did learn to think in deeper time intervals than that. That little town had a rather arid climate, but somebody had managed to arrange to have a tunnel bored through to bring water from that river that was flowing through that deep canyon out into the plains out around for irrigated agriculture. And having learned that when I was a little kid, I was able to appreciate later on the engineering feats of modern Eastern hydraulic civilizations, as they were called. And we have to see beyond the merely political implications of these large irrigation projects, which Karl Wittfogel called Oriental despotism, when he analyzed the role of early irrigation works in Asia and emphasized the societal impact of bureaucratic structures that their maintenance required. We have to go beyond politics. There's a lot happening to us politically right now, but we have to go way beyond it really to understand what's happening. By inventing ways to relocate water to affect local aridity, muscle-flexing humanity began thousands of years ago to take control of nature's geological features. That's really something for a particular species, our species, Homo sapiens, to try to control nature. Such hubris was extended by other inventions that have since enabled humankind to exploit one form of energy after another. Technological magnification of human abilities has shaped history again and again. To understand the habitual hubris of our species and to comprehend how seriously it has misled us, we need to think in terms of much longer time scale than even my childhood exposure to that river-eroded canyon enabled me to accept as familiar. Inventions, and we're good at making inventions, but they usually have other effects besides the intended effects. The fact that this is so underlies the human predicament in our time. Had the effects of steam engines been confined to the specific beneficial service intended by Thomas Newcomen and James Watt, pumping water out of British mines, we would not now be living in the wake of massive fossil fuel combustion and would not face the need to discuss the side effects of all of our controlled uses of fire. Now, let me illustrate this point about inventions having other effects than were intended with a trivial example, but it gets the idea across. Somebody invented several decades ago a sticky tape, celluloid tape with stick them on the back of it, and you can fasten things together with it. Scotch tape is the brand name that we're used to in my country. Whoever invented that didn't have the intention of enabling professors to adorn their office doors with all kinds of newspaper clippings and cartoons and so on. But I want to mention one cartoon that I couldn't resist taping to my office door. A forestry magazine some years ago published a cartoon that I found irresistible. I labeled it an early example of an environmental impact assessment. It showed a pair of 17th century American Indians atop a hill overlooking the Atlantic coast, watching European men coming onto the beach from a sailing ship anchored just offshore. The cartoon caption had one Indian saying to the other, "Oh, let's let them stay. What possible harm can they do?" Well, now, a couple of centuries later, we are beginning to see how much harm they've done. For adequate comprehension of that harm, our actions brought us to the present predicament, and for insight into the future prospects of the human species, our perspective must extend very much farther back than just to European expansion into the New World, although that was an important event. We must also break the habit of looking forward no further than just one or two election cycles. Moreover, the consequences of our use of hydrocarbon fuels will never be adequately understood if viewed apart from a context provided by principles of ecology. It has become essential to recognize that all creatures, human or otherwise, impose a load upon their environment's abilities to supply what they need and to absorb and transform what they excrete or discard. What is meant by an environment's carrying capacity for a given kind of creature living a given way of life? Carrying capacity is the maximum persistently feasible load, the load just short of what would begin damaging that environment's ability to support life of that kind. We have exceeded carrying capacity. We're now living with a carrying capacity deficit, which most people don't recognize. Carrying capacity is conventionally quantified as the number of creatures living in a given manner which a given environment can support indefinitely. That word indefinitely is essential there. But that phrase, living in a given manner, is an essential modifier of the mere head count measure. That's what makes the human carrying capacity of an island, a continent, or even a whole planet more complicated to assess than the carrying capacity of a pasture for sheep or cattle. When at a particular time the load of some species of users happens to be appreciably less than the carrying capacity of their environment, there's room for expansion of numbers, for enhancement of living standards, or both. That was a glorious feature of the early history of what we called the New World. But loads can increase until they exceed that sustainability limit. Then overuse of the environment reduces the carrying capacity. That's the predicament of our time. Overuse of the environment reduces the already limited carrying capacity of an environment, including a whole planet. Most people still resist seeing the relevance of the carrying capacity concept to the human condition. This dangerous avoidance of an essential concept must be regarded as a serious instance of what was called by a sociologist 90 years ago cultural lag. This one may well turn out to have been the most perilous cultural lag ever. Other instances of biocultural lag have become all too common, and such lag was perhaps epitomized when economist Julian Simon, a few years ago, bewitched by the notion that human inventiveness would always solve any problem, declared the carrying capacity concept had lost all useful meaning. But without this useful conceptual aid to vision, intelligent people fail to see or refuse to see that overuse of an environment sets up forces that will necessarily, in time, reduce load to match shrunken carrying capacity. Now, I've put some slides in my thing here that are not necessarily in the order in which I find that I really want to show them, so I'm just going to jump ahead here. Let's see. Okay, let's start with this one. It is a fact of life that any organism and any population must use environment three ways. We have to have an environment that's a source of the sustenance materials that we use. We have to have an environment that we can live in, that's activity space for us. We have to have an environment that is a disposal site for the things that we generate in the process of living. In an overloaded world, this becomes a sad fact. That's one of the beauties of English that unfortunately gets lost in translation. The initials there, SAD, spell the word sad, and I don't know how that translates into any other language. But we need those three kinds of environment: a source of sustenance, an activity space, and a disposal site. And when we become too numerous, doing too much, it becomes difficult to separate those three activities, to separate the environment from which we get our raw materials, the environment in which we live, and the environment into which we dispose of things. So, we need to learn another ecological concept to make sense of our lives these days. A niche, or niche, depending on how you like to pronounce it, N-I-C-H-E, can be defined as the role that an organism of a given kind plays in an ecosystem. Although technically this involves many dimensions, for our purposes it's important simply to distinguish three broad aspects of an organism's way of relating to its environment. That's what we've got on the screen right now. An organism needs an environment from which to take sustenance materials. It needs an environment in which to carry on its interactions. It needs an environment into which to dispose of the end products of life processes. Now, unlike other species whose niche requirements are so largely determined by their genetically based traits, our culturally varied and diversified traits and activities make us a multi-niche species. Different humans live in different ways, and you know that very well. One of the basic implications of this is that the nutrients we require are not just food for our bodies, but the many materials for our exosomatic extensions, the many artifacts that we use. Ethnic, cultural, and especially occupational differences can function ecologically as equivalents of species differences. Human cultures change through time, so human niches today are vastly different from ancient human niches. Nevertheless, the environment of even a human population is finite. That is to say, a given environment can supply only limited quantities of the substances needed. It affords finite space in which their accustomed interactions can occur, and likewise its capacity for absorbing and recycling and transforming the materials that they have transformed is limited. Regardless how inadequately measured may be these environmental limits, they are real, and they are what is meant by the phrase carrying capacity. Now, on the resource front, it is sometimes recognized that Justus von Liebig, a German, Austrian, I guess he was, agricultural chemist, his law of the minimum applies. That law says the least abundant necessary resource is what limits the sustainable load's magnitude. Not the stuff you've got the most of, the stuff you've got the least of that you need is what's going to be the limit. We can extend this principle using this set of ideas to say that ultimately carrying capacity may be limited by whichever of those three broad environmental functions is least adequately met. A shortage of disposal space or a shortage of living space may be as limiting as a shortage of some vital resource, food or fuel. Now, consider what's involved when one species population, as a component of the environing ecosystem, is used as a resource by another species population. We harvest other species for feeding ourselves, doing various things. It applies no less to herbivores or to people who are vegetarians, for whom plants are their prey, than it applies to carnivores or omnivores. It also applies to autotrophic plants for whom abiotic materials, that is, soil nutrients, water, etc., are their prey. Exploitation of prey species was illuminated by one of the most important scientific discoveries of all time, and it's a discovery that most people these days tend to shrug off as not really very important. The recognition by Thomas Robert Malthus of the vast significance of the fact that the human species was capable of reproducing in excess of the level required in usual circumstances for replacement of each mortal generation. For too long, too many people have imagined that Malthus has been refuted. They have misread him. Here are the two best-known sentences from his famous 1798 essay on the principle of population. I emphasize two essential words that are customarily neglected. Population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. Those were Malthus's words. Leaving out those two words, when unchecked, inverts the meaning of what Malthus was saying. And that's why people imagine that subsequent history has refuted him. Malthus wasn't predicting exponential increase all the time. His language is archaic, but he was correctly noting that populations tend, when possible, to over-reproduce and could thus grow exponentially. His essay was about what held populations back from maximum potential increase. Had the checks on population growth, such as he discerned, not operated, the 950 million contemporaries of Malthus, with whom he shared the planet in 1798, would have doubled in a quarter century. European settlers in the New World, with a fresh continent to exploit at the time, had done so. Anyone should be able to do the arithmetic. Another doubling by each subsequent generation would have loaded the world after 2 centuries by 1998, 200 years after Malthus wrote, with about 242 billion people. If you don't believe it, just try it sometime. Take 950 million people living at the time of Malthus, double that, double it again, double it again, double it 8 times, and you'll find that it comes to 252 billion people. Now, we've recently heard about a population explosion. We've had a population explosion since the Second World War, but we just recently passed the 7 billion mark. That's far short of the 252 billion that we could have had if we had doubled every generation, every 25 years since Malthus's time. Although Malthus himself had in fact recognized potential excess reproduction as a characteristic of all species, he focused his attention just on what it was going to do to humankind. And it's to Charles Darwin's credit that he generalized the Malthusian insight there. And among other things, what it does is to show how it is possible for us to crop various other resource species. As long as we don't harvest each generation more than the surplus that they have reproduced in that generation, we can go on growing more and more wheat. We can go on raising more and more sheep or cattle or whatever. But if you overharvest, which we're doing now with the fisheries in the oceans, pretty soon you exhaust the supply. The extent to which a resource species has ability to over-reproduce is finite. Overharvesting, using a resource species faster than it can reproduce, must eventually deprive the user population of its former bounty. This is the basis for recognizing that carrying capacity is not unlimited. And it's at this point that I think maybe that song title has relevance. Que sera, sera. If we are over-harvesting this, that, and the other thing, we're going to have a bill to pay. As our ancestors became human, they began to loosen the bonds of a fixed niche, but this in no way negated the carrying capacity concept. As technology changed and as ways of organizing a human population for ecosystem use changed, the niches available for supporting human life changed. For a long time, these technological and organizational changes had the overall effect of increasing niches available for human occupancy. But even that would change. Now I have to go back and find, well, it's the one I didn't get put on here, a table that I was going to show you. So I'm going to have to ad-lib a little bit here, and I apologize to the interpreter for this. It's going to make life difficult. The table had 5 rows, and in the first row, I showed the increase of population from about 35,000 BC to 8,000 BC. So if you can just imagine, I'm putting up a table on the screen here. The top row will have the period from 35,000 BC to 8,000 BC. In 35,000 BC, when we finally were the dominant species, Homo sapiens, there were only about 3 million people on the whole planet. By 8,000 BC, there were about 8 million people. So in those 27,000 years, we had doubled and doubled again, almost. Not quite 2 doublings. The average doubling time during that period was 18,750 years. Now, what kept us from doubling any faster than that? That's awfully slow. Nobody would have been aware of any increase in population when we were increasing that slowly. Well, we were all hunters and gatherers at that time. We weren't really much farther ahead, in spite of calling ourselves Homo sapiens with a big brain up here. We weren't very much ahead of Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis and the various other Homo species prior. But we were relying entirely, almost entirely, on renewable resources, the things that we could harvest. But we were, as hunters and gatherers, we were relying upon nature to provide those resources. They were things that we harvested that had been put where they were by uncontrolled processes of nature. Humans weren't controlling them. Now, in my second row of the table, I would go from the 8,000 BC to about 1500 AD, when the population of humans increased from 8 million, this is the whole world, to about 350 million by 1500 AD. So the doubling time had been reduced to 1/11 of what it had been before, now down to only 1,745 years. What was the big change that increased the speed at which we were growing? The beginning of agriculture. If you go back to 10,000 years ago, that's about the time that it was discovered that people could make things they wanted grow in a place instead of simply harvesting stuff that happened to be there. Somebody spilled some seeds that had been fortuitously gathered before near their home camp and on moist soil, and they sprouted and grew, and it was probably a woman who discovered that, because the women tended to be the gatherers and the men the hunters in the hunting and gathering economy. So women can take credit for the first major breakthrough that advanced us. Okay, what happened in 1500 AD? Well, that's the onset of mass production, you might say. That's when we started using plows rather than just digging the soil to plant our things. And so from 1500 AD to 1800 AD, a very short period of time, that's only 3 centuries. The doubling time diminished again down to a little over 200 years. Every 200 years we were going to double the population of humans on the planet. Another thing that happened, of course, in addition to plowing, making agriculture a mass production process, we now had the New World into which we could expand. And here, Spain is at fault. It was the Spanish king and queen that financed the exploratory expedition of Cristoforo Colombo. and discovered there was another whole hemisphere out there. Well, that could only happen once. You don't have more second hemispheres to discover after that. So when I would advance then to the fourth row in my table, starting in 1800, that's just about at the beginning of the industrial era. What happened? That's just after James Watt had perfected the new common steam engine, perfected it, improved it. He's made more improvements later. And we started producing all kinds of things by mechanical means with energy from fossil fuels. So from 1800 AD to about 1865 AD, only less than a century now, not quite 2/3 of a century, we reduced the doubling time, the rate of increase, to a doubling time of about 130 years. We went from 969 million at the time of that 1800 time marker to 1865 to 1,375. Yeah, 1,371 million in 65 years. And the big change that we were making was that we were now using fossil fuel energy in great abundance, and we were beginning to be dependent upon ongoing harvesting of resources, not only the fuels, but the minerals that we had to use for the various artifacts we were making that were not renewable resources. They didn't grow like crops. And we kept discovering more supplies of them here and there, but we mistook the discovery rate for a renewal rate, which it isn't. Now, why do I cut off that row at 1865? Well, that's the end of the American Civil War, so it's easy for my colleagues at home to remember it. But it was also the time at which antiseptic surgery began. So the last row of my table would begin in 1865 and come down to near the present. In 1865, 1,371,000,000 people inhabited the planet. At the end of the 20th century, we just passed the 6 billion mark. So the average doubling time during that period was 63 years, and toward the end of it, we were doubling much faster than that. Some parts of the world doubling every 25 years, a few places doubling even faster than that. I think the average in the last decade or two of the 20th century is at the rate of doubling every 40-some years. What happened? The antiseptic surgery advent meant that we now had death control. We were beginning to control not only the planet, but we were controlling the rate at which we died, which enabled us to increase in numbers. Industrial societies then had committed themselves to harvesting resources that don't reproduce and trying to do it on what amounts to the same kind of sustained yield basis that seemed plausible when they were relying entirely on renewable resources. If we hadn't thought of discovery as the equivalent of replacement, we might not have got ourselves into the predicament that we are in. But we did make that mistake. That's part of our hubris. And so that's the reason that what will be, will be. So how colossal are we? Now, let me see if I've got, I've lost my place here. Here we go. Here's an equation that we can use to tell how colossal we have become. I think of our species now not just as Homo sapiens with a big brain, but Homo colossus. We've got all these tools. Homo colossus is a creature that can come all the way from the west coast of North America to Valencia here to give a few remarks on our predicament. We couldn't have done that a couple of centuries ago. Even if UIMP had existed then, they couldn't have sponsored this kind of a gathering. How do we do it? We have all of these extensions of our bodily apparatus. Aluminum wings that I could put on and take off. I got in and strapped this device to myself, and it brought me here. And when I got here, I unstrapped it and took it off, and here I am. And you see before you a Homo sapiens, but I'm really part of Homo colossus. And the fact that we have those extensions is a major consideration. Now, this equation that I have on the screen now was devised by another agricultural chemist, Max Kleiber. They seem to come from that part of Europe. M equals W to the 3/4 power times 70 and expressed in kilocalories. M is the metabolic rate of a species. What is their basal metabolism? How many kilocalories of energy do they expend or consume in a day? And W is their weight in kilograms. Kleiber found that from mice to elephants, that's quite a range of size, this formula seemed to apply approximately. Well, now we can kind of extrapolate it. If we think of ourselves not just as a consumer of 2,000 to 3,000 kilocalories a day of food, but if we think of ourselves with all of our apparatus consuming all of the fuels that keep those apparatus going, Homo colossus, the American version of it at least, by the turn of the century, had become the equivalent to about a 41-ton dinosaur. Now, if you imagine yourself sitting in a room like this with, what are there, about 50 people back there, 50 41-ton dinosaurs. that's what you're surrounded by. And that's why we're in trouble. Now, let me go back to an earlier notion here, the from which, in which, and into which uses of the environment. And again, I wish that I were as multilingual as I like to pretend I am, because I don't know how this would work in other languages, but in English, I can make verbs out of those. If we need an environment from which to take things and into which to put things and in which to do things, we are going to be, we now, as Homo colossus, we're doing a lot more from whiching than we ever did before we became colossal. We're doing a lot more in whiching, like flying from Seattle to Valencia. And we're doing a lot more into whiching, the stuff we dump, the stuff we put into, the fact that we treat the atmosphere of this planet as a disposal site is egregious. We should never have begun doing that. So Homo colossus, I'm regarding as a subspecies of Homo sapiens. There still are some people on this planet that are basically still just Homo sapiens. They don't have much in the way of apparatus. We call them undeveloped or underdeveloped. And we have the developing nations. And the developing nations we really ought to think of as consisting of Homo colossus people. And unfortunately, we've got it in our heads that the underdeveloped countries will all eventually catch up with the developed countries. If they do, we've had it. That's the end of things. Homo colossus should be regarded as a subspecies, and what we have to hope is that when we run out of carrying capacity for Homo colossus, that the successor to Homo colossus will be Homo sapiens again, that we can revert to the old ways. Now, most of us that have become very colossal could not personally revert. I don't have any agricultural skills. I couldn't go back to living on a farm. I never did live on a farm, so I would be ill-equipped for it. Probably most of you would be in that same condition. But we have to hope that there will be a human population that can go back to living the way we lived before we tried to become so colossal. Now, the interesting thing about it is that we are not only users of tools, but the tools have become, in effect, part of us. I had to take off my glasses to check something here because my glasses are a prosthetic device. Prosthetic devices are devices that replace the function of an impaired portion of your anatomy. A person with a prosthetic leg can get around. In the recent Olympics, there were people running with prosthetic legs. Two of them, a guy that had lost both legs in a war, had these funny things at the bottom of below his knees there, and he was actually running in a relay race. They were part of him. There was a long debate as to whether he should be allowed to participate in the Olympics. Well, we all have, I see several of you out there that share my need for supplementary lenses to do what the lenses inside my eyes no longer are quite adequate to do. And I noticed one of the speakers here in the previous program kept taking off one pair of glasses and putting on the other. I don't have sense enough to have a second pair. I have just the pair so I can see all of you. I have to take them off to read properly. A hearing aid is a prosthetic device that makes it possible to hear when something is not quite right with the hearing. I, years ago, decided that a little transistor radio with an earplug that I put in here was like a hearing aid, but a very different kind of hearing aid. It enabled me to hear somebody speaking 1,000 miles away. It gave me hearing power that no creature ever had before. And that's true of many of our artifacts now. Now, we're not the first species that has prosthetic devices. Chickens swallow pebbles that function in their gizzards like molar teeth. They grind up the food. After they gobble down whatever food they're eating, it gets ground up down inside the tummy there. And as you probably are aware, it's now considered that birds are descended from dinosaurs. Somebody has found some dinosaur specimens that had gizzards like chickens, and they had stones in them. So the use of tools, that is, gizzard stones, goes back all the way to the age of dinosaurs. So humans are not unique in the fact that we do use tools. We're unique in the abundance of tools and the vast diversity of the tools that we use. The fact that we make tools using fire and that we use fire to do things with does make us unique. When it was discovered that a fire that was spontaneously set off inside an enclosure would expand things, and they invented firearms, that's what made the discovery of the New World and the colonization of the New World by people of European origins possible. The expansion of the gases inside a gun barrel that could propel the bullet out the muzzle of the gun was an important device in making colonization of the New World possible. Well, then the steam engine that powered industry operates on the same principle, the expansion of gases inside an enclosure with a piston instead of a bullet being driven upward in that cylinder. And then if you can repeat that again and again, and you can gear it to some machinery, it can do all kinds of things for us. And then we finally learned about internal combustion engines, burning gasoline or petrol or diesel oil inside an engine. And that's what makes it possible for us to be what we are nowadays. I'm skipping over a number of things here in this script. Now, who made the mistake? Was it the Homo erectus that discovered he could carry a branch from here to there and start a new fire? Or was it Thomas Newcomen? Or was it James Watt? Who was it that put us on this track to our own self-destruction? I think the fault really goes back all the way to Homo erectus. And if it's any comfort to think that things that we are now doing to our planet are going to make it less and less habitable by Homo colossus in the future, well, let's blame it on Homo erectus. He got us into this mess, or we got ourselves into it by following his example. There are already so many Homo colossus and so many more striving to become comparably colossal, for example, China, that it's at least as important to consider what our abundant into-witching is already doing to planet Earth as it is to worry about whether our cumulative depletion of fossil fuel stocks must soon curtail our exuberant from-witching. We're going to run out of the stuff, but not suddenly. The change in atmospheric composition is affecting climate. Recent years have brought spectacular advances in the science of climatology. There's much reason to believe that the devastation of New Orleans and vicinity by Hurricane Katrina may have been a precursor of future catastrophes. Severe weather events have been made more frequent and more disastrous because Homo colossus has become ever more numerous and urbanized, and we dump vastly more combustion products into the air than did pre-colossal Homo sapiens. Sea level will rise as global warming proceeds, and many human settlements in coastal lands around the world will be devastated. Now, I don't know what your altitudes are here right in the town of Valencia, but you're on the coast, so within the next century, you're going to have some big changes happening right around here that'll be due to what we've been dumping into the atmosphere. It goes up the chimney and it's gone, or it comes out the tailpipe and it's gone. And we're running out of gones. Who's to blame for it, we asked pejoratively when we began to see some troubles happening. And that's the wrong approach, to worry about who's to blame. Right now in my country, there's an election campaign going on. In a couple of weeks, we'll be deciding whether to re-elect Obama as president or to elect, what's his name? Mitt Romney as his opponent. And they're neither one of them talking about what really matters, what we're doing to the planet that we live on. They just aren't talking about that. And there are people beginning to object to the fact that they're not talking about it. I don't know whether in the next 2 weeks they'll wise up and begin talking about it or not. We need to realize that our reactions to hard times ahead don't just make matters unnecessarily even worse. We need to realize there are ways in which we could do things differently. Not that we can prevent catastrophe from happening now that there are 7 billion of us, with well over 1 or 2 billion already living colossally and the rest trying to live that way. But we need to realize that there are different ways we could do things that wouldn't make this planet less habitable by ourselves. Will we continue to divert attention by engaging in wars of mass distraction? Shakespeare was a smart man who saw some of this coming. His version of King Henry IV, as he was dying, advised his son about to become King Henry V, "Be it thy course to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels." That's what a lot of our politicians are doing, busying giddy minds with foreign quarrels. Those of us that can become enlightened about all of this, it's our task to ungiddy as many minds as we can reach. Is it less giddy when we merely assume that we can eat our cake and have it too by devising ways to sequester the carbon dioxide that we generate with our ravenous burning of hydrocarbon fuels? The hubris of Homo colossus precluded recognizing how these geological processes that long ago locked so much carbon away underground had served us by doing an enormous sequestering job. Without nature's removal of vast quantities of carbon from the primordial atmosphere, Earth would not have had the kind of air, climate, and surface environment in which animal life, including eventually Homo sapiens, could evolve. Perhaps the ultimate human error was our ancestors' innocent misconception in defining and thus perceiving the underground carboniferous substances as available fuels. If we hadn't defined coal as a fuel when we found it in quantity, where would we be today? Well, I wouldn't be here, I'd be somewhere else. But defining the stuff as meant for burning led to massive, ongoing, ultimately disastrous de-sequestration. So we shouldn't be talking glibly now about sequestering the carbon that we release by burning. We should recognize that it was sequestered for us long ago by all those microorganisms that lived long before there were terrestrial creatures, and then all the plant life that has lived both in the ocean and on the land. Can we do this? Can we achieve magic by just re-sequestering? We shouldn't talk about sequestering. We should call it re-sequestering. How much of the energy thus obtained will we have to use to accomplish the re-sequestration? Will there be any net energy release? As petroleum has ceased to be inexpensive, we've begun allowing ourselves to become preoccupied with alternative fuels, gas and coal, and then ethanol and other biofuels, and finally hydrogen, hoping thereby to continue our accustomed prodigality. If you remember the Bible story of the prodigal son, went and got his inheritance early and went out and spent it all with lavish living. That's what we're doing. We're living prodigally. I don't think that's going to be a solution. 30 years ago, I concluded my book, Overshoot, by saying history would record as a brief interlude the period of global dominance by Homo colossus. I said our most urgent task was to discover and develop policies designed not to prolong that period, but to ensure that the successor to Homo colossus will be, after all, Homo sapiens. Humans did formerly live less lavishly, using much less energy. We're tempted now to adapt to post-peak oil circumstances with attempts at minimal downsizing, updating fuel efficiency standards required for automobile manufacturers, enacting carbon taxes, changing our light bulbs. There's a lamp in the hotel room that hangs right over my head in the bed there, and I noticed it had one of those neat little curly bulbs in it. That's worth doing, but that's not going to save us. Now, there is a Spanish translation of that Overshoot book available now, and it's a strange sensation to pick that up, and I think I wrote this, and I can't read it. I hope some of you will read it, and some of you who are bilingual, where the second language is something other than either Spanish or English, is something else, translated into that. Maybe we'll get somewhere. Our most urgent task, I said, was to develop policies not to prolong the period of Homo colossus, but to ensure that the successor to Homo colossus will be Homo sapiens. The fact that there is increasing publicity about our predicament might seem a hopeful sign. People are going to catch on. But modern cultures too often embed such publicity in contexts that trivialize it. Habitual preconceptions can blind us to the message we need to read. Back in 1979, when I was negotiating with the University of Illinois Press about a cover design for Overshoot, I sent the editors a color photo of an oil well in a field of oilseed-bearing sunflowers, which I intended to represent the fact that we had become dependent on harvesting simultaneously both contemporary and prehistoric photosynthesis. The oil well represented harvesting prehistoric photosynthesis. The sunflowers represented contemporary photosynthesis. The people at the University of Illinois Press rejected the photo because they thought I was merely trying to represent unaesthetic disfigurement of a flower bed by an intrusive oil well. And they didn't think it was ugly enough. Well, that wasn't the point I was trying to make. It didn't need to be ugly. Anyway, that aura may be changing. I was able at last to use that photo in the cover design for my 2009 book, Bottelneck, Humanity's Impending Impasse. Meanwhile, a dramatic news magazine cover had admonished us all to be worried, be very worried. That was Time magazine in April 3rd, 2006. Major articles in that issue of Time magazine seriously tried to explain why serious worry was justified. But could their words effectively persuade? Think of another biblical passage now, the proverb, where there is no vision, people perish. Events within my lifetime suggest a need for updating that version, that proverb, that precept. I've tried to suggest that we see with ideas as well as with eyes. What you see depends on what's in here as well as what's up here. To adapt the proverb to our resource-depleted world, we should say, where people lack vision-enabling concepts, their vision will remain deficient. Let me conclude with this statement. That holds for popes, princes, and presidents, and people at large. Where people lack vision-enabling concepts, their vision will remain deficient. And this gathering was all intended to convey useful concepts needed in the future. Que sera, sera.
Bueno, nos queda tiempo para una, dos preguntas, como mucho. De todas formas, mañana estará también el profesor R.Catton en la mesa redonda y por tanto que se quede con algo en el bolsillo para preguntar lo puedo hacer mañana.
¿Utiliza usted el auricular?
I don't have is this it here? There we go. Okay. Let me get it disentangled here.
Nice volume of films.
Okay. I now become Homo Colossus.
Igual que yo. Muchas gracias por su presentación y quería agradecerle también el planteamiento del tema con una característica que suele estar fuera de este discurso de crecimiento, de sobrepasamiento de los recursos, que es el tema de la población. Quizás el tema de la población es de los más delicados y los que todo el mundo evita porque quizás es tabú o políticamente incorrecto o porque choca con las religiones, con nuestros valores, nuestros principios de decir hasta aquí hemos llegado, no podemos seguir creciendo como población. Es decir, usted decía recursos que tenemos, la fuente de recursos, la actividad y los desechos. Bueno, quizás hemos consumido demasiado petróleo, hemos consumido demasiados peces, demasiados recursos y no tenemos dónde echar los desechos. Pero ¿qué hay de nuestra actividad cultural, nuestra actividad humana, ¿no? ¿Cómo piensa usted que podríamos afrontar ese tema?
It depends a little bit on who we regard as speaking authoritatively about such matters. And we have, in the population issue, an issue that has been assumed to be under the authority of religious people. We have to recognize that there are other aspects to that problem than those that were thought about by religious sages long ago. I refuse to believe that the last word on that was pronounced 2,000 years ago. I think that we've learned a lot since then. We know a lot more about the reproduction process. We know about how a single cell, a fertilized ovum in the uterus, becomes a human being born as a baby and then grows up to be somebody who can think and write and speak and so on. And I think we ought to be paying attention to other authorities that have taken into account much that has happened since the original ideas were laid down, that instead of thinking every baby born is a gift of God and to accept it and do the best you can for it and so on, we should say that doing the best we can has to take account of much that has been learned in many centuries since that attitude developed. And we have to recognize that in the political system, where, as I said, we tend not to look more than 1 or 2 election cycles ahead, that the things we do today have consequences that go a lot farther ahead than that. And somehow we have to train our voters and our politicians to think in longer terms than just the next 2 years or the next 4 or 6 years or whatever. I don't know whether that fully answers your question, but those are my thoughts on it. I find it interesting to hear what I said in English being transferred into my ear in Spanish almost as I'm saying it. There was an exhibit at the World's Fair in Seattle in 1962 where you could go into a little booth and you talked into a microphone and there was a loudspeaker in the booth and it played what you said, but it delayed by a couple of seconds. And it was almost impossible to keep talking when you were hearing yourself 2 seconds behind. Well, at least this is a language I wasn't understanding, so I could keep talking. Technology does work wonders. And I'm pleased with a lot of the technology that we've devised, and this is fun, but we've got to be careful. There's many of our technological achievements are contributing to our undoing. Okay. Well, that was fun while it lasted.